All right, everyone. This is Matt Baumgartner here with Luke Gajary, and Luke is a good friend of mine. We go back a couple years and had the privilege of doing life together and ministry together. It seems like it was a previous life that was true in the case, but excited to have him here today to talk with us a little bit of youth ministry, a little bit of the challenges of doing youth ministry and the current era that we're in and the challenges of the last couple of years, and also the mental health challenges that come along with that. So, Luke, we're excited to have you here. Introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit more. Thanks for taking time to be on this with us today.
Man, Matt, thanks so much for having me. It's great to reconnect. And yeah, maybe 13, 14 years ago, I started off, I was a Youth Alive missionary associate in North Texas. Did that for about 3 years. And so I was involved in youth ministry in that capacity, went to a little ministry school here in the Dallas area and just got connected in ministry pretty quickly, got married, and um, then took a season of getting full time into digital marketing and social media and did that for a while and then felt called back into youth ministry December of 2017. And so my wife and I served for almost 5 years at a church in Abilene, Texas as the youth pastors there. And it was kind of a culture shock because I had done youth ministry in a parachurch sense years earlier, and my interpretation of youth ministry then is that you could play a couple games at the front end, throw Cheetos on people covered in whipped cream, and then preach a message and do some worship, and you've had a successful night. And when we went into full time ministry, the end of 2017, it was a very different climate, and I was a little bit. Some of this stuff, go, man, they didn't teach me this in the ministry school program I was in. Like this is where are we? It's very different. So um, out of that began to just the Lord really shifted my approach to youth ministry and kind of taught me on the fly some things. So, man, I'm looking forward to kind of diving into some of that, sharing with you, what we've done. So,
If it helps you out at all, I've got ministry degrees and I've taken youth ministry classes, bachelor and master's degree level. And then you find out there's a lot of things, even at that level, that they just don't teach you, and that you still no substitute for learning on a Wednesday night or at youth service, or when they hand you the keys to the church van and say best of luck, and
yeah,
walk back
100%.
slowly, back away from you. So
Yeah, exactly. And it's the only way to smell like sheep is to be around sheep. You can't get the education done and think you're successful until you're actually around the sheep. So that's a huge part of it for sure.
Luke, I think one of the first times that I met you or really got to know you, I think I'd met you a couple times before, but I think we were in El Salvador, uh, sleeping on
That was
church
the trip.
floors, eating pupusas, and you were the clown or something most of the days. I don't know.
Dude, yeah, that was my first out of the country missions trip. And I was a little unhinged on that trip. That was a lot of fun. That was a good time. But it really, that's one of those things too, to trips like that, they solidify some relationships and connections. I still talk to some kids that were in your youth ministry then that were on that trip too. It's crazy.
Some good guys for sure. Well, let's dig into this topic. You mentioned something that I thought was interesting. You became a youth pastor in at Abilene in 2017, 2018, and
Hmm.
things had changed. But then obviously we know things changed in our world during that time. So talk about what that was like, being a youth pastor. We're going to have youth leaders and youth pastors, and even some lead pastors will be watching this. That some of them experienced that. Some of them are even coming in after the fact, and they're like, "What did I miss?" So
Yeah. And really, I mean, you kind of hit it head on. Like things changed in a big way during COVID, obviously, but then even before that, there's been a huge cultural shift with Gen Z in particular. And so I come into this youth ministry position. The Lord led us there. It was an awesome opportunity. We were blessed to be full time in that role. And we walk in, and I have a sermon series planned to start the year off. And I preached the first one, and I realized it's not really landing. And so we kind of step back, and I go, okay, the next Wednesday, I sit down, I have a blank journal. We've been in Abilene a total of like 12 days. And I have a blank journal, and I say, I grab the mic and I say, okay, here's what we're going to do. I want to hear what you need to be taught. Like, what are you going through? And I'm going to put the mic down and write in this journal And then, so we had like a weird youth service because it was just kind of an open mic thing. Like, tell me what you're struggling with. And my wife and I wrote down topics in this journal as the night went on. This was January 2018. And we're writing stuff down. And then we get home later, we put our kids to bed and we go through this journal and we realize we're flipping through like 60% of the topics had to do with mental health, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, things like that. And we're going, okay, this cute little series that I had planned on foundations of the Christian faith may be helpful, but it's not really what these kids are dealing with right now. And so we kind of called an audible and shifted our whole ministry focus and poured a lot of time and energy into developing resources on mental health. I looked for some existing ones, and there was a lot of, in my opinion, kind of dry, not super helpful resources. I think that has changed now, even in the past 5 years. But at that time, it was kind of a sad landscape. Either people were very dismissive, and it was, oh, just pray more, read your Bible more, or it was more of a very in-depth psychological approach of like, you need to go see a counselor tomorrow and get on medication. And I think somewhere in the middle is the truth. And I was trying to find those resources, and I'm going, I don't have. Number one, at that point, I had never really struggled with anxiety, depression. And number two, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a licensed counselor. Like I'm not authorized to talk about this, but I was, my wife and I were talking one day and we're going, I don't know. I was constantly discouraged because I'm like, I can't preach this series. I don't know what I'm talking about. And then I realized, I don't have to be an expert in this topic to have spiritual authority over this topic. And so I was reminded of a story I had read years ago about the Titanic. There was a baker born in England. Charles Joan was his name. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but he is actually credited as the number one. He got the most people off the Titanic before it sank. And so he was a baker on staff working on the boat. And when it hit the iceberg, he was resting in his bunk. He ran upstairs to find out what was going on, figured everything's going down. We got to save as many people as we can. He ran back down to his bunk, took a shot of whiskey, ran back upstairs and started throwing lifeboats overboard, getting people on lifeboats. He started throwing off furniture off the deck to try to save people. He was just a crazy, partially buzzed baker, but he ended up becoming the most instrumental officer in getting people off the boat to safety. And so he wasn't the safety officer. He had nothing to do with, he had no training in lifeguard behaviors or CPR, any of that. He just was a crazy baker on a mission. And I'm like, you know what? That's my role here. I'm just going to be a crazy baker on a mission, and we're going to bake a little cake and see what the Lord does. Like that story of the widow who Elijah says, take the last of the oil and flour you have and make a cake with it. And the Lord multiplied what she had. And so like, we know that God can do the same thing with our resources. And so we developed a series and we preached it, and we saw the Lord do some stuff. But it became pretty clear that this was not an issue that one series is going to fix, or one, not to discredit what God can do through the teaching of the word, but to say this is more than just a one series or one sermon issue. This is an ongoing battle that we really have to really dig in with these kids,
Yeah. I think this is so good. And just hearing you come to a realization of the importance of these issues, because I think the people that are going to be watching this video, youth leaders, youth pastors, our leaders across the state of Wyoming, they probably can resonate with so many of those things, but also with this idea of like, people are talking about mental health challenges, but where's my role in that? And even if we're honest, historically, the church has not known how to address these issues, or what their role is in that. And there's some places, some people that have got it right, but by and large, we've kind of fumbled on what our response is in terms of mental health challenges, possibly in part because we just didn't fully understand them. And now there's such a need for this here in Laramie, where we live. We have several mental health professionals in our church, and they're incredible people, but they're booked solid 100%.
Yeah.
Can't get anybody in, even in emergency situations. It's just that's the reality of the situation because of the mental health challenges and needs that exist in our community. And so I'm sure that from what I hear is repeated over and over and over again around the country, different places where There's so many people, so many needs, and where do we even begin? And where do we as church leaders begin? So thanks for tackling that with us as well. So
Yeah, and that's a big part of it too, is just, and I'm not positioned, and there's a hairy line, right? Because you cannot call yourself a counselor. You can't, you just, there are certain things that, with mandatory reporting, there are things that we occasionally need to escalate to a professional. And so I'm not saying that pray more, read your Bible, study this issue, and then now you're an expert and you can solve every mental health crisis. But I think that by opening up the conversation, I mean, it's the same thing here. It was the same in Abilene. Mental health professionals were way 6, 8, 12 weeks out from even having a consultation. And so I think that we as ministers can fill in the gaps on some level, and be available and be understanding, more than just, oh, have more faith and pray and God will take your depression away. It's like, okay, there's some truth to that. Like, I had a roommate in Bible college. He was from South Carolina, and he advocated so hard that South Carolina barbecue is the best barbecue. And it's very like pork based, mustard based. It's a very different style. And I loved Texas, like the very minimal sauce, salt, pepper, garlic powder on brisket. Like that's the thing. And so we argued all the time about which barbecue was better. And then finally one time we went and we got this place that had South Carolina barbecue, and then we went and got a place that had Texas barbecue. It's like, you know what? They're both freaking awesome. Like, why does one have to win? Like, why can't we just agree that both are good? And so I think that's kind of the approach that we need to take as ministers, of go, yes, there's faith and there's prayer and there's deliverance and there's spiritual warfare. And yes, can we just recognize that there's a cultural anxiety that has risen over the past 5 years or more? There is a mental health issue. There is an increase in hormonal imbalances and psychological problems that need to be addressed. And so it really is an issue of finding that middle ground and going, okay, here's a spiritual battle and here's a physical battle. Like, I would, if you were wearing glasses, I wouldn't tell you, like, take off and I actually had this happen in Bible school. Like, I was praying that God would heal my eyesight because I wear glasses. And it's like, okay, I'm going to close my eyes, open them, and pray that God will heal my eyes. But I'm not going to go drive home without wearing my glasses, right? So, like, my wife is thankful that I have faith and believe that God can heal my eyesight, but she's thankful that I wear my glasses when I drive, right? So I don't know why we take a different approach sometimes when it comes to mental health. It's like, there is sometimes an issue where we have to lean into the professionals and deal with clinical issues in a stronger way. Although, again, we can't 100% say that's all the solution either. There is a spiritual warfare going on. There is a spiritual battle happening. We need to engage on both fronts.
sure, absolutely. And that's kind of the elephant in the room, right? Because I think there's probably some people on one extreme that have even come to the point of saying, like, all this mental health stuff is just a bunch of baloney,
Mm-hmm.
People on the other extreme, everything's got a demon, and like, somewhere in the midst of that, there's, God cares about the situations that we face in our life. He's not caught off guard by mental health needs and crisis and all these kinds of things.
Right.
His word has so much hope and power. And obviously, as pastors, we understand the fundamental need of people to have a relationship with Jesus, but there's also a care and a compassion element for those other areas of life, especially when it comes to kids and youth and teenagers and young adults that are struggling and don't know where to turn. And they're looking to leaders that would care enough to speak into these areas of their life as well. And I think the gospel is big enough to encompass those issues that we have in life as well, alongside those of our faith, and how those even can mesh together, and what God's word would speak into us when we're facing depression and anxiety. Certainly, we know there's our heroes from the Bible that we look up to that experience these wide range of emotions, and publicly, or at least publicly in terms of they wrote it down and we have it in our Bible today,
Right.
are expressing to God their anguish and their emotional being everywhere. Think about David in the Psalms and so many others that cried out to the Lord and expressed what they're going through. And certainly we know that that's not something that God doesn't care about, and that would be the last thing we would want to communicate to our students or to the church or to the world at large. And so I'm excited for the resources that you've developed and how those will help speak into students' lives, but help us as leaders to be resourced to speak into students' lives and have something to say in terms of this conversation. Because like you said, when you're thinking back to the sermon series, like, what am I going to say? How am I, sometimes we feel so unprepared. And yet we know that there's hope for people that are facing anxiety and depression and whatever it is that maybe that is going on, that we know that there's hope. We know that God cares. We know that we can care. And so share with us a little bit about those resources and what that looks like, and maybe even some more of your journey developing these and putting them into use in youth ministry.
Yeah, no, and I think half of it is, maybe more than half, is just being a leader that's sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit and sensitive to the nature of these issues. And so we understand that we are called and trained and equipped to deal with these problems and to lead people. And we all ultimately have the helper, the Holy Spirit, who's available to be as much a resource as anything else. So I really had to come to grips with that when I developed that first sermon series. And then we preached it again the following year, and I tweaked it and I added to it. I added some layers. There was a Canadian study done in the early 2000s, I believe it was, and they took the story of Winnie the Pooh, and this is where the title of my book that I'll talk about in a second comes from. And we titled the series "Deep in the Woods" because they took the story of Winnie the Pooh and broke down each of the characters into a clinical, like a mental health disorder. And so Christopher Robin was a schizophrenic because he was making up all these characters in his mind that they were coming alive. And then Winnie the Pooh had this addictive personality. And then Tigger was ADHD and hyperactive. And so they took and so I literally threw a picture on the screen in our sermon of a character and then basically correlated them. And kids were like yelling at me, like, stop ruining my childhood. And we had an intern, we developed a bumper video that had the cute fun, like Winnie the Pooh, that theme song. And then it glitches out and turns almost into like a horror movie trailer of like, deep in the woods, there's a darkness you wouldn't expect. And it gets all dark and grim. And that series really enlightened everybody to go, wow, here's a church or a youth pastor that's talking about like real clinical problems. And we used real research. It wasn't like, oh, I'm just making up stuff. It's like, no, this is real research. And then a few weeks after that series, it was a great series. It went over really well. And it really opened the door, but it led me to become a person that was willing to make this an ongoing conversation. And we had a youth service a few weeks after that, and it was like one of the smallest, worst attended youth services we've ever had. There was like 12 kids there. We normally on a Wednesday had anywhere from 60 to 80 kids, and it was like a small group. And I was like, you know what? It was 3 minutes left on the countdown video. I said, let's just go gather. We had these couches on the back. Let's just do something a little different tonight. Let's go gather on the couches. I told my worship leader to get his guitar. We went over and got in a circle, and we just did some acoustic worship for a minute. And I didn't know this at the time, but one of our seniors had brought one of their friends that they worked with at Dunkin' Donuts. And we got into a time of prayer and transitioned from worship to the message or the conversation at that point, because we were more in a small group setting. And I felt the Lord drop in my spirit as we were praying to transition. I saw a picture of a girl wearing a dark coat, and I kept seeing the number 3, the number 3, the number 3. And so I'm not the most prophetic person on the planet, but I've had enough of those encounters with the Lord to know, like, okay, let's not just move on to the message. Let's time out here and address this. And I said, I don't know who this is for. And I looked around the room and I said, this is what the Lord's showing me. And I said, there's someone in here. I feel like the Lord's showing me you're wearing a very dark, like heavy coat. And I keep seeing the number 3, the number 3. And this new girl that had come for the first time, she starts crying. And I was like, okay, I guess there's something here. Like, let's talk about that, you know? And so I said, does this connect with you? And she can't even respond to me. She's crying. And I prayed for her in that moment, and we prayed for her, and she just is a puddle of tears on the floor. And we were like, I don't really know what to do. Again, one of those things we didn't talk about in Bible school, right? And so we pray for her, and she gets to a point where we feel like the Lord's done something in her life. And then we continue into a small group discussion, and we dismiss. And the girl comes up to me afterwards, and she goes, I don't know anything about this. I haven't been in church since I was like 7. She was a senior in high school, and she goes, 3 years ago, my grandfather died in a car accident, and it really messed with my head. And at that moment, I started battling with depression 3 years ago. And so when you said the number three and the dark coat, I knew right away that was for me. That 3 years ago I took on a dark coat, and I feel like tonight that coat came off. And I was like, sheesh, like that's good, you know. And she got baptized the following Sunday in our church.
Yeah.
She started following Jesus. And it was like, okay, yeah, the sermon series are great. All the content's great, but ultimately it's about becoming a vessel to bring healing to those areas. And this girl had been in and out of counseling, in and out of therapy. And in a moment, the Lord did a work in her heart. And she went back to therapy. She continued therapy. She didn't opt out of it just because we had prayed for her, but it accelerated her deliverance and her growth. And so after we did that series with the research and we had some prophetic ministry as a part of it, I realized the Lord was doing something bigger than just some sermon series. So I started writing a book based on all this content that I was studying. I wanted it to outlast a series. I wanted it to be a bigger thing than that. And so I ended up compiling, we preached it every year we were on staff at that church. And I ended up compiling it all into a book called Deep in the Woods. And it was written for Gen Z, ages 12 to 24. I did give some copies to some friends of mine my age. And they've said it even has helped them. But it was really written as a practical approach to deal with mental health struggles like depression and anxiety, and not the end all be all, but really a resource to deepen the conversation, to continue to develop strategy. So in this book, I give kids tools to fight back. Obviously, I talk about the clinical struggles and the balances, but probably 60% it's weighted towards the spiritual battles. And like, for example, one of the things I talk about is, let's talk about your Spotify. If I looked up your Spotify 10 most listened to songs, how are those informing your mental like, and kids would come up to me all the time and say, I'm really struggling with depression, anxiety. Okay, pull up your Spotify real quick or your Apple Music and show me what you're listening to right now.
Yeah.
And that really does matter. And that really informs like how students live. Same thing with their friends, you know, like there's a story I tell in the book where Queen Alexandra of Denmark, she was a duchess in the late 1800s in England, and she had gone through a severe bout with rheumatic fever, and she was left with a limp at the end of that battle with this disease. And so she was very famous. It would be like us looking up to the Kardashians today. And so everybody in England looked up to her, and she limped everywhere she went. And people started limping just to mimic how Queen Alexandria walked, not because they had a limp, but because they were mimicking somebody that was limping. Even cobblers and shoemakers started making shoes that were uneven. So one heel would be 2 inches and the other heel would be 3.5 inches, just so that women could buy this set of shoes and automatically limp.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes an issue of who are you looking at that's limping? You maybe don't have a limp, but you're mimicking somebody that does, and you need to get away from that person, get your eyes on Jesus, and you'll walk straighter if you're walking with Jesus instead of walking with a friend with a limp, right? And so that's not to be dismissive to say you don't have a mental health problem or you're not struggling, but I wonder how much of your struggle is coming from a place of you're looking at the wrong people, you're hanging out with the wrong people. And so that's really the angle of the approach. I do address that there is clinical issues, there is a deeper problem. I give some resources to professional resources and direction to professional resources, but then I also address there's a spiritual root at the base of this thing, and let's address the spiritual root and see what happens, and then from there, you know, move on. So I have this book, it's on Amazon. The link for it is lukegajary.com/books, just my first and last name /book. People could purchase one copy just to check it out, or also have bulk discounts available for orders of 10 or more if people are interested. And then I basically packaged the content back. So I took all my sermon content and put it into a book, and then I undid it and put it back into a sermon series and made that series available on that same website. So if youth pastors want to use it, I know sometimes bivocational, you're just scrambling for resources you can throw on a screen and have some good notes to follow. So I have the notes built in. I have all the graphics there, the bumper videos and stuff that we used. And so all that stuff is there as well, just to help youth pastors kind of dive into this topic, or even senior pastors.
That's awesome. I appreciate those resources. I actually just shared on our group this last week your series that you'd shared about Pentecost Sunday. And so,
Yeah,
those resources are awesome and huge help to youth leaders, and whether it becomes a sermon series or a small group discussion series or whatever, however that can help, or even just some personal
exactly.
stuff. So thank you for those resources. That'll be great. We'll share those links below. I'm going to order a couple of cases of these books. Camp is coming up here in a few weeks. I want to have some on hand to give out to some of our leaders that are there at camp. But this is a great resource that could be ordered and used for a small group to kind of walk through. And you mentioned some discounts for ordering in bulk, and so that's a blessing too for our leaders.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't write this book to make money. I wrote it really to have a resource. And so I on those bulk copies, I have there's no profit margin in there. It's really just like for people who want them. There's another good resource I'll mention that I use too. It's very small, but Louis Giglio wrote a book called is it called Facing Goliath or Defeating Goliath? And then there's a resource he pulled out of that book called Putting an X Through Anxiety, and it's like $1 on christianbook.com or something. And I used to order just dozens of those at a time to hand out, and that's another great resource as well. It's a little bit smaller and more surface level, but it was one of the few resources that I found that really helped us as far as like having something to put in students' hands, and there's a few criteria, right? So like it needs to be easy to digest, it needs to be easy to read, needs to be engaging for a kid that has a very short attention span, and needs to not take me a month to get through it. I need to be able to get through this book in 2 or 3 settings. And so that's what the goal of this was. And that's, again, another resource that I found super helpful.
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate that, and we'll look forward to digging in. I think this is a great resource. It's not it's very balanced in terms of it's not either or, but it allows the faith component to speak into these challenges that Gen Z is facing and that our world is facing today. And people are searching for answers, and if we can have compassion for the situation that they're facing. I mean, it's just the same thing that Jesus did, right? He used the physical need as an open door to get to the spiritual. And I think that's a huge opportunity for the church today, especially in terms of Gen Z. If we can care and show compassion to a generation that's hurting, that's confused, that's been through things that are crazy at an age where I was talking to someone recently about just graduation a couple of years ago, and like, because of COVID, no graduation, no prom, no, all the things that that people are even celebrating this weekend was kind of all just stripped away. And in addition to, being locked down in homes and people that you love dying or choosing not to, see you physically for a couple of years or whatever. So many of these different things compounded on top of all the things that we already know that kids and teenagers face at a critical time in their life. And so resources for leaders are incredible, because what's expected and what the questions that are asked to us are so crazy. One question I had for you, and we can end with this, is just what is one shift that you would recommend for a leader or youth pastor to make in terms of this whole conversation that we're having about allowing our faith to speak into the mental health situation that students are facing? What's a shift or a couple shifts that you'd say this was key, and when I began to do this, it opened up opportunities for me to minister in this area?
Man, that's a good question. I think what you said about Jesus and his ability to meet the physical need, and that opened a door to the spiritual need. I think in the same way, being accessible and available to talk through these issues, and not necessarily, the temptation is to be the savior, to know all the answers and to know exactly what to say. I don't think any member of Gen Z is expecting you to know all the answers, but I think they want a seat at the table with you to work through it. And so some of this may not look like having an awesome sermon series, or may not look like having a really good presentation on how to deal with mental health. It may just look like being present and having a appropriate approach to dealing with mental health. And on a practical level, that looks like less stage time and more just coffee time with students. And it also means engaging with parents, and parents don't know how to have these conversations and deal with this topic. And parents sometimes are dismissive as well, and chalk it up to teenage angst and hormones and going through puberty. And so I think also, while we're simultaneously dealing with this with students, we need to be equipping parents. Axis.org is a great resource that I use to help find documents. I think it's like $2. You can download a PDF on anything, and they have great resources that I would download and then share with parents, based on, of course I would vet it and make sure it was something I agree with theologically, but that also that it became a two-pronged approach. Like, I need to comfort the students and help the hurting, but then I see them for 2 hours a week and their parents are seeing them for the other 166. And so how am I helping the parents? If I'm just meeting the immediate needs of the students, I'm helping, but I also need to meet the needs of the person that they see the majority of their time. So that was a big thing that I leaned into, and I would encourage people to see yourself as half a youth pastor and half a parent pastor, in addition to, and I hate to layer on another thing to do, but I'm not saying add this to your plate. I'm saying shift your plate a little bit to make room for parent ministry.
Man, that's so good. I think that's really, really helpful for our leaders and for the situation that we're going through. I really appreciate you getting on here and sharing this. Like I said, we'll post some links. I'm going to add you to our leaders group too. So if they have questions, they can ask you directly. But thanks so much for your time. Thanks for taking time to be with us here and sharing your insights, your resources. We look forward to connecting with you some more. We got to get you here to Wyoming to do some more life and ministry together, and so people can meet you in person.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I appreciate you having me on, and I'll send you the ebook too that you can post with this if people want to skim it or browse it before buying 10 copies. I know sometimes as a leader you want to proofread stuff and vet it, and so happy to give that out, the ebook, to strengthen any type of research that you want to do. But man, thanks again. This was really fun to talk about this and have this conversation, and it's a hard topic, but I think that even people just showing up to watch this, you're signing up and you're making an effort, and that's half the battle, showing up.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's certainly the world that we live in, and I just think this will be super helpful for youth leaders going into kind of a different season that we all experience in the summer, of a little less on the structure, a little bit more opportunities on trips to camp and times at camp and small group discussion times and fireworks stands and concession booths and whatever it is that youth leaders are doing with students. And some of these conversations come up, being prepared, being equipped, and, making this an intentional emphasis of our ministry, I think can really make a huge difference for our leaders. So thank you again so much. We'll post those links. Appreciate your time, and God bless. We'll talk to you soon.
100%. Thanks, Matt.